An HOA blocked firefighters from saving a dying man. They had to cut the gate down. Today's story hits hard because it's not just a story. It's a real-life tragedy shared with us by one of our viewers, a former firefighter and EMT who witnessed the devastating consequences of HOA negligence. This is the entrance to Pinewood Estates, a gated community in Georgia where a man's life was lost. Not because of a fire, not because of a medical emergency that couldn't be treated, but because of an HOA's arrogance. Firefighters arrived to save 72-year-old Robert Ellis, who was having a heart attack, but the gate was locked, and the HOA had no emergency override. The team had to cut through the gate with a rebar saw to get inside, but it was too late. Robert didn't make it, and now the HOA board is being sued for their negligence. They even had the audacity to sue the fire department for property destruction. This is HOA Karen Files, where we expose the HOAs that put rules over lives. Have you or someone you know been blocked by an HOA during an emergency? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more. Let's dive into how this tragedy unfolded and how justice was served. Robert Ellis, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher, lived in Pinewood Estates, a gated community in a quiet suburb of Savannah, Georgia. The community was known for its manicured lawns, upscale homes, and strict HOA rules, which Robert had always followed to the letter. He'd moved there 5 years ago after his wife passed away, seeking a peaceful place to spend his retirement. Robert was a kind man, loved by his neighbors for his warm smile and the way he'd sit on his porch every evening, reading history books and waving to kids riding their bikes. He was active in the community, often volunteering to plant flowers along the entrance or organize book drives for the local library. But Robert had a heart condition, congestive heart failure, that required careful monitoring, and he always kept his emergency alert bracelet on, just in case. On a humid July evening, Robert was in his living room, flipping through a biography of Abraham Lincoln, when he felt a sharp pain in his chest. His vision blurred, his breath came in short gasps, and he knew immediately what was happening. He was having a heart attack. With trembling hands, he pressed the button on his alert bracelet, which automatically dialed 911. "I need help," he managed to say, his voice weak as he gave his address to the dispatcher. "Pinewood Estates, please hurry." The dispatcher, a young woman named Sarah, stayed on the line, her voice calm but urgent. "Help is on the way, Mr. Ellis," she said. "Just hold on, we'll be there soon." She dispatched the nearest fire department, Station 12, located just 3 miles away, along with an ambulance from the county EMS. At Station 12, Captain Mike Torres, a 45-year-old firefighter with 20 years of experience, was on duty with his team. The alarm blared through the station, the dispatcher's voice crackling over the speaker. "Code 3, possible cardiac arrest, Pinewood Estates, 142, Oak Lane. Elderly male, 72, alert bracelet activated." Mike and his team, Lieutenant Jessica Hayes, a former EMT, and firefighters Chris and Gwen and David Carter, sprang into action, grabbing their gear and piling into the fire truck. The ambulance followed close behind, its sirens wailing as the convoy sped toward Pinewood Estates. "We've got to move fast," Mike said, his hands gripping the wheel, his jaw tight. "Every second counts with a heart attack." Jessica nodded, checking the defibrillator in her bag, her mind racing through the steps of CPR. They'd done this run dozens of times, but something about Pinewood Estates made Mike uneasy. He'd heard stories about their gate. Pinewood Estates was surrounded by a tall wrought iron fence, with a single entrance controlled by a security gate. The gate was operated by a keypad, requiring a code to open, and was designed to keep out unauthorized visitors, as the HOA board often boasted in their newsletters. But there was a problem, one that would prove fatal. Despite state laws requiring gated communities to have an emergency vehicle override, a special key or system that allows first responders to open the gate quickly, Pinewood Estates had no such mechanism. The HOA board, led by President Karen Mitchell, a 60-year-old real estate agent with a reputation for micromanaging, had installed the gate 3 years ago through a cheap contractor to save costs. They'd ignored the contractor's recommendation to include an override system, with Karen dismissing it as unnecessary during a board meeting. "We don't need ambulances and fire trucks coming in here all the time," she'd said, according to the meeting minutes. It lowers property values. The board had also neglected to inform the local fire department of the gate code, a standard practice for gated communities, leaving first responders with no way to access the neighborhood in an emergency. Mike's fire truck screeched to a stop in front of the gate, the ambulance pulling up behind. The gate loomed before them, its black metal bars unyielding, the keypad glowing faintly in the dusk. Mike jumped out, his boots hitting the pavement, and ran to the keypad, hoping to find an override slot, a standard feature that would accept a universal key carried by all emergency responders in Georgia. But there was nothing, just a numeric keypad and a small speaker for residents to buzz in guests. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike muttered, his heart sinking. He pressed the call button, hoping someone in the security office would answer, but the line was dead. No one was on duty. Jessica joined him, her face pale as she glanced at her watch. "We're losing time," she said, her voice tight. "He's in there, and we can't get to him." Chris and David grabbed a set of bolt cutters from the truck, trying to break the lock on the gate, but the metal was too thick, the cutters barely making a dent. Mike radioed the dispatcher, his voice urgent. "We're at Pinewood Estates. Gates locked. No override. No response from security. We need the code, or we're cutting it down." Sarah, the dispatcher, tried calling the HOA's emergency contact, Karen Mitchell, but the call went straight to voicemail. "I'm sorry, Captain," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I can't get through. Do what you have to do." Mike made the call, his training kicking in. "Get the rebar saw," he told his team. "We're cutting through." David ran back to the truck, grabbing the heavy-duty rebar saw, a gas-powered tool designed to cut through steel. The team worked quickly, sparks flying as the blade bit into the gate's locking bar, the screech of metal echoing through the quiet evening. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the noise, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" A woman called from her porch, her voice carrying over the sound of the saw. "There's a man having a heart attack," Jessica shouted back, her hands steady as she helped guide the saw. "We can't get in, the gate's locked." The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and ran inside to call her neighbors, spreading the word. Inside his home, Robert was fading fast. He'd collapsed onto the floor, his books slipping from his hands, his breath shallow and ragged. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a crushing weight that made it hard to think, hard to move. He thought of his late wife, Margaret, her smile, her laugh, the way she'd always told him to take care of himself. "I'm trying, Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes fluttering closed. The sound of sirens in the distance gave him a flicker of hope, but it was so far away, so faint. He didn't know if they'd make it in time. Back at the gate, the firefighters finally cut through the locking bar, the metal giving way with a groan. Chris and David pushed the gate open, the heavy bars swinging wide, and the fire truck roared through, the ambulance following close behind. They sped down the winding streets of Pinewood Estates, their sirens blaring, their lights flashing, until they reached 142 Oak Lane. Mike was the first out, his team right behind him, their gear clanking as they ran to the door. It was unlocked. Robert had managed to leave it open in his last moments of consciousness, and they burst inside, finding him on the floor, unresponsive, his pulse faint. Jessica dropped to her knees, starting CPR immediately, her hands pressing rhythmically on Robert's chest. "Come on, sir, stay with us," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Mike set up the defibrillator, attaching the pads to Robert's chest, while Chris and David assisted the paramedics from the ambulance, who'd arrived seconds later with a stretcher. "Clear," Mike shouted, delivering a shock, Robert's body jerking under the current. They worked for 15 minutes, their movements a blur of precision and desperation, but Robert's heart wouldn't restart. The paramedics called it at 7:42 p.m. Robert Ellis was gone. Mike sat back on his heels, his hands trembling, his face pale. He'd lost people before. It came with the job, but this one hit hard. They'd been so close, just 3 miles away, but the gate had cost them precious minutes. Jessica wiped her eyes, her hands still on Robert's chest, her voice a whisper. "We could have saved him." The team sat in silence, the weight of the loss heavy in the room, the sound of the ambulance's radio crackling in the background. Outside, the neighbors gathered, their faces etched with grief, many of them crying as they realized what had happened. Robert was gone, and the HOA's negligence was to blame. The news of Robert Ellis's death spread through Pinewood Estates like wildfire, the community reeling from the loss of a beloved neighbor. The next morning, a small group of residents gathered at Robert's house, placing flowers on his porch, their voices low as they shared memories of the man who'd always had a kind word and a warm smile. "He helped my son with his history project last year," one neighbor, a single mom named Lisa, said, her eyes red from crying. "He was the best of us." Another neighbor, an elderly man named George, shook his head, his voice trembling with anger. "This never should have happened. That gate, it's a death trap. The HOA knew it, and they did nothing." Captain Mike Torres and his team returned to Station 12, their hearts heavy with the weight of the call. Mike sat at his desk, filling out the incident report, his pen moving slowly as he recounted the events. The locked gate, the lack of an override, the desperate minutes spent cutting through the metal. He'd been a firefighter long enough to know that gated communities were required by Georgia law to have an emergency vehicle override, a universal key system that allowed first responders to access the gate quickly. Pinewood Estates had none, and Mike knew that failure had cost Robert his life. He called the county fire marshal, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "We need to investigate this HOA," he said. "They violated state law, and a man died because of it. I want them held accountable." The fire marshal, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Carter, agreed to launch an investigation, coordinating with the Savannah Police Department and the county EMS. She visited Pinewood Estates the next day, meeting with Mike and his team at the gate, which still bore the scars of the rebar saw, jagged cuts in the metal, the locking bar hanging loose. Linda examined the keypad, her expression darkening as she confirmed the absence of an override slot. "This is a clear violation," she said, taking photos of the gate for her report. "They're supposed to have a Knox-box system, a slot for a universal key that all first responders carry. There's nothing here, and they didn't even give us the gate code." She interviewed the neighbors, many of whom expressed their outrage, their voices a chorus of grief and anger. "The HOA board is obsessed with control," George told her, his hands shaking. "They care more about property values than people's lives." The HOA board, led by Karen Mitchell, was quick to deflect blame. Karen, a tall woman with a sharp jawline and a penchant for designer suits, called an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse, her voice dripping with indignation as she addressed the residents. "The fire department overreacted," she said, her hands on her hips, her tone dismissive. "They didn't need to cut the gate. They could have called me for the code. This is willful property destruction, and we're not going to stand for it." The residents gasped, their anger boiling over. "A man died, Karen," Lisa shouted, her voice breaking. "Robert needed help, and that gate stopped the firefighters from getting to him. How can you blame them?" Karen's face reddened, but she doubled down, her voice cold. "The gate is there for your safety. It keeps out riffraff. If the fire department had followed protocol, this wouldn't have happened. We're suing them for the damage, and that's final." The board's decision to sue the fire department for willful property destruction sent shockwaves through the community, the residents' outrage reaching a fever pitch. Lisa, George, and a group of neighbors organized a protest outside the clubhouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Robert," and "HOA killed our neighbor." They shared their story on social media, posting photos of the mangled gate and Robert's porch, now covered in flowers, with captions like, "Pinewood Estates HOA let a man die. Hold them accountable. #Justice for Robert." The posts went viral, racking up thousands of shares on Facebook and Twitter, with hashtags trending across Georgia. Local news stations, including WDOC 11, picked up the story, interviewing Lisa and George in front of the gate. "The HOA board knew that gate was a problem," George said, his voice trembling with emotion. "They ignored the law, and now Robert's gone. We want justice." The viral attention caught the eye of Robert's daughter, Emily Ellis, a 40-year-old lawyer who lived in Atlanta. Emily had been devastated by her father's death, her grief compounded by the knowledge that he could have been saved. She drove to Savannah the day after the news broke, her hands shaking as she walked into her father's house, the biography of Lincoln still on the floor where he dropped it. She sat on the couch, her father's favorite blanket in her lap, tears streaming down her face as she thought of all the moments they'd never share. Holidays, birthdays, the quiet evenings on the porch. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have been here." But Emily wasn't just a grieving daughter. She was a lawyer with a fierce sense of justice, and she knew the HOA was to blame. Emily met with Mike and Linda at Station 12, her expression a mix of grief and determination as she reviewed the incident report. "My father didn't have to die," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "The HOA violated state law by not having an override system, and their negligence cost him his life. I'm filing a wrongful death lawsuit against the board, and I want your team to testify." Mike nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said. "Your father deserved better." Emily also reached out to the neighbors, gathering statements from Lisa, George, and others who'd witnessed the HOA's negligence over the years. Complaints about the gate, ignored requests for an override system, Karen's dismissive attitude at board meetings. "We're in this together," Emily told them, her voice strong. "We're going to make sure this never happens again." Back at the fire station, Mike and his team prepared for the HOA's lawsuit, their anger tempered by a quiet resolve. They knew they'd done the right thing. Cutting the gate was the only way to get to Robert, and they'd do it again in a heartbeat. But the HOA's arrogance, their refusal to take responsibility, lit a fire in Mike's chest. He thought of Robert, a man he'd never met but had fought to save, and the daughter he'd left behind. "They're not getting away with this," he said to his team, his voice low but fierce. "We're fighting back, for Robert, for Emily, for every person who might need us in the future." The stage was set for a legal battle that would shake Pinewood Estates to its core. The wrongful death lawsuit filed by Emily Ellis against the Pinewood Estates HOA board sent ripples through the community, the residents grappling with a mix of grief, anger, and hope for justice. Emily worked tirelessly, her law office in Atlanta a flurry of activity as she gathered evidence. Incident reports from the fire department, statements from neighbors, county records showing the HOA's failure to comply with state law, and even the original contract with the gate's installer, which included a recommendation for a Knox-box override system that the board had explicitly rejected. She also hired an expert witness, a fire safety consultant named Dr. Alan Brooks, who testified that the lack of an override system directly contributed to the delay in Robert's treatment, costing him his life. "In a cardiac arrest, every minute matters," Dr. Brooks said in his deposition, his voice grave. The 8-minute delay caused by the gate was the difference between life and death. The community rallied around Emily, their support a lifeline in her grief. Lisa organized a candlelight vigil in Robert's honor, held in the community park just outside the gate, where over 100 residents gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They shared stories of Robert, his love of history, his kindness to their children, the way he'd always bring extra flowers to the park to brighten the space. "He was the heart of this neighborhood," George said, his voice breaking as he held his candle high. "We failed him, but we won't fail his memory." Emily spoke last, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "My dad loved this community," she said, her hands trembling as she held a photo of Robert smiling on his porch. "He deserved to live, to see his grandchildren grow up. The HOA took that from him, from all of us. We're fighting for justice, not just for him, but for everyone who might need help in the future." The crowd cheered, their candles a sea of light in the darkness, their resolve unshakable. The viral attention continued to grow, with the hashtag Justice for Robert trending nationwide, shared by firefighters, EMTs, and families who'd experienced similar issues with gated communities. A group of firefighters from a neighboring county started a petition, "Require emergency overrides now," calling for stricter enforcement of override laws in Georgia, which gained 10,000 signatures in a week. The story caught the attention of national news outlets like NBC Nightly News, which ran a segment on Robert's death, interviewing Emily and Mike in front of the mangled gate. "This isn't just about one man," Mike said, his voice steady. "It's about every person who might need us. Gated communities can't put profits over lives." The segment sparked a wave of outrage, with viewers flooding the HOA's office with calls and emails, demanding accountability. The HOA board, meanwhile, doubled down on their lawsuit against the fire department, claiming the damage to the gate, estimated at $15,000, constituted willful property destruction. Karen Mitchell gave an interview to a local paper, her tone defiant as she defended the board's actions. "The fire department acted recklessly," she said, her arms crossed, her eyes cold. "They should have waited for the code. We're a secure community. That gate is there to protect our residents, not to harm them." The interview backfired spectacularly, with readers flooding the paper's website with comments like, "She's delusional," and "A man died," and "She's worried about a gate." The board's arrogance only fueled the community's anger, their protests growing louder, their signs now reading, "Karen must go," and "HOA murderers." Emily's lawsuit gained traction, with the court scheduling a hearing for early September, just 2 months after Robert's death. She prepared meticulously, her nights spent poring over legal documents, her days meeting with witnesses and experts. She visited Pinewood Estates often, walking through her father's house, touching the things he'd loved, his books, his gardening tools, the rocking chair on the porch. Each visit was a mix of pain and purpose, her grief driving her to fight harder. She met with Mike and his team, their bond growing as they shared their determination to hold the HOA accountable. "You did everything you could," she told Mike, her voice soft but firm. "Now it's my turn to fight for him." The fire department, meanwhile, prepared for their own legal battle. Their lawyer, a pro bono attorney named David Harper, who'd lost a brother to a similar incident years ago, building a defense that highlighted the HOA's negligence. David gathered statements from other fire departments in the area, many of whom had faced similar issues with Pinewood Estates, their calls delayed by the gate, their patients put at risk. "This isn't the first time," David told Mike, his voice grim. "They've been warned before, and they did nothing. They're going to pay for that." Mike nodded, his jaw tight, his mind replaying the moment they'd found Robert on the floor, the life already gone from his eyes. He thought of his own father, a retired firefighter who'd taught him the importance of every second, every life. "We're not just fighting for Robert," Mike said, his voice low. "We're fighting for every call we'll ever get." The community's grief turned to action, with residents organizing a letter-writing campaign to the county commissioners, demanding stricter oversight of HOAs and mandatory inspections for emergency access systems. They also started a GoFundMe to help Emily with legal fees, raising $10,000 in a week, with donations from firefighters, EMTs, and families across the country. "We're with you, Emily," wrote a donor from California, a paramedic who'd faced a similar gate issue. "Don't let them win." Emily used the funds to hire a private investigator, who uncovered emails between Karen and the board, showing they'd ignored multiple complaints about the gate over the years, dismissing them as overreactions. The emails were a bombshell, proving the board's willful negligence, and Emily knew they'd be key in court. As the hearing approached, the community held a memorial service for Robert, gathering in the park where they'd held the vigil, their voices raised in song as they honored his memory. Emily stood at the front, a small urn with her father's ashes in her hands, her voice steady as she spoke. "My dad believed in this community," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "He believed in kindness, in helping others, in doing what's right. We're going to do right by him. We're going to make sure his death wasn't in vain." The crowd applauded, their hands clapping in unison, their candles glowing in the night, a symbol of their unity and their fight for justice. The courtroom in Savannah was packed on the day of the hearing, with residents, firefighters, and reporters filling the seats, their faces a mix of anticipation and anger. Emily Ellis stood at the plaintiff's table, her suit crisp, her expression a mix of grief and determination, her father's photo on the table in front of her. Across the room, Karen Mitchell and the HOA board sat with their lawyer, a slick attorney named Richard Baxter, who'd built a career defending HOAs in liability cases. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Margaret Evans, entered the room, her presence commanding as she took her seat, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This is a case of wrongful death and negligence," she said, her voice clear. "Let's begin." Emily's case was airtight, her evidence meticulously presented. She called Mike Torres to the stand, his firefighter's uniform a stark contrast to the courtroom's formality, his voice steady as he recounted the night of Robert's death. "We arrived at the gate within 4 minutes of the call," he said, his hands clasped in front of him. "But there was no override system, no way to get in. We had to cut through the gate with a rebar saw. It took 8 minutes, and by the time we reached Mr. Ellis, it was too late." The jury listened intently, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy, several of them wiping tears as Mike described finding Robert on the floor, their desperate attempts to save him. "If we'd had access, we could have saved him," Mike said, his voice breaking. "That gate cost him his life." Dr. Alan Brooks, the fire safety expert, testified next, his analysis damning. "Georgia law requires gated communities to have an emergency override system," he said, holding up a copy of the statute. Pinewood Estates had none, and they failed to provide the gate code to first responders, a standard practice. The 8-minute delay directly contributed to Mr. Ellis's death. Emily presented the emails from the HOA board, her voice steady as she read Karen's words aloud. "We don't need an override system. It's unnecessary. It'll just encourage emergency vehicles to come in and lower our property values." The jury gasped, their anger palpable, the board's negligence laid bare. The HOA's defense was weak, their lawyer, Richard Baxter, attempting to shift blame to the fire department. The firefighters acted recklessly, he argued, his voice smooth but unconvincing. They should have waited for the gate code. Cutting the gate was unnecessary and caused significant damage. But the argument fell flat, the jury's expressions hardening as they listened. Karen took the stand, her demeanor cold and unapologetic, her answers evasive as Emily cross-examined her. "Did you know about the state law requiring an override system?" Emily asked, her voice sharp. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting to her lawyer. I wasn't aware," she said, her voice faltering. "But the gate was there to protect our residents." Emily held up the emails, her voice rising. "You were aware. You rejected the override system because you thought it would lower property values. You put profits over lives, and my father died because of it." The courtroom was silent, the weight of Emily's words hanging in the air, Karen's face pale as she sat down. The HOA's lawsuit against the fire department was heard in the same session, a decision Judge Evans made to streamline the proceedings. David Harper, the fire department's lawyer, presented a robust defense, calling other first responders to testify about their own struggles with Pinewood Estates Gate. This wasn't the first time. A paramedic named Sarah testified, her voice steady. "I've been delayed by that gate 3 times in the past year. Patients suffered because of it." David also presented the fire marshal's report, which confirmed the HOA's violation of state law and highlighted the urgency of the situation. Robert's life was on the line, and cutting the gate was the only option. "My clients acted to save a life," David said in his closing argument, his voice passionate. "The HOA's negligence created this tragedy, and now they have the audacity to sue the very people who tried to help. This is an outrage, and it cannot stand." Judge Evans deliberated for just 2 hours, her decision swift and decisive. In the wrongful death case, she ruled in favor of Emily, finding the HOA board liable for Robert's death due to their negligence. "The evidence is clear," she said, her voice firm. "The Pinewood Estates HOA violated state law by failing to install an emergency override system, and their willful negligence directly contributed to Mr. Ellis's death. I award the plaintiff $2 million in damages, to be paid by the HOA board, and I order the immediate installation of a compliant override system." The courtroom erupted in cheers, Emily collapsing into her chair, tears streaming down her face as Lisa and George hugged her, their relief palpable. In the HOA's lawsuit against the fire department, Judge Evans was even more scathing. "This claim is not only baseless, it is an affront to justice," she said, her eyes locked on Karen and the board. "The fire department acted in the best interest of a dying man, and you dare to sue them for doing their job? I dismiss this case with prejudice, and I order the HOA to cover all legal costs for the fire department, $50,000 in total. Furthermore, you are required to replace the gate with a new system installed by a licensed security contractor that complies with all state laws, including a Knox box override. This court will not tolerate such reckless disregard for human life." The residents cheered again, their applause deafening, while Karen and the board sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, their arrogance shattered. The ruling was a victory, but it was bittersweet for Emily. She stood outside the courthouse, the photo of her father in her hands, her voice steady as she spoke to the press. "This is for you, Dad," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "We got justice, but I'd give anything to have you back." Mike and his team stood beside her, their uniforms a symbol of their shared fight, their hands on her shoulders in silent support. The community gathered around, their signs now reading, "Justice served," and "Thank you, Emily." Their voices raised in celebration of a victory that would protect them all. In the aftermath of the trial, Pinewood Estates underwent a transformation, the community coming together to heal from the tragedy and ensure it never happened again. The HOA board was forced to comply with Judge Evans's ruling, hiring a licensed security contractor to install a new gate system, a state-of-the-art setup with a Knox box override, a keypad with an emergency code provided to all first responders, and a 24/7 security officer to respond to calls. The installation cost the HOA $200,000, a price that included removing the old gate, rewiring the electrical system, and adding new safety features like a backup generator to ensure the gate would open during power outages. The residents watched as the old gate was torn down, their cheers echoing through the neighborhood, a symbolic end to the board's reign of negligence. Karen Mitchell and the board faced a reckoning, their reputations in tatters after the trial. The residents, empowered by the victory, called for a special election to remove them, their votes unanimous as they replaced the board with new members, Lisa, George, and a retired firefighter named Tom, who'd lived in Pinewood Estates for a decade. "We're here to put people first," Lisa said at the first meeting of the new board, her voice strong. "No more gates, no more rules that hurt our neighbors. This is a community, not a prison." The new board implemented a series of reforms, including regular safety audits, a direct line to the fire department, and a fund to help residents with medical alert systems, ensuring that no one would ever be left helpless again. Emily used the $2 million from the lawsuit to start a foundation in her father's name, the Robert Ellis Safety Fund, dedicated to advocating for emergency access in gated communities. The fund partnered with firefighters and EMTs across the country, providing grants to install override systems in neighborhoods that couldn't afford them, and lobbying for stricter laws to enforce compliance. "My dad's death was preventable," Emily said at the fund's launch, held in the park where the vigil had taken place, the new gate gleaming in the background. "We're making sure no other family has to go through this." The fund's first grant went to a small gated community in Florida, where a similar gate issue had delayed an ambulance, helping them install a Knox box system that saved a child's life just months later. The trial's impact reached far beyond Pinewood Estates, sparking a national conversation about emergency access in gated communities. The Require Emergency Overrides Now petition led to new legislation in Georgia, dubbed Robert's Law, which mandated annual inspections of override systems, with heavy fines for noncompliance, up to $50,000 per violation. Similar laws were proposed in 15 other states, with advocacy groups using Robert's story to push for change, their flyers featuring a photo of him smiling on his porch, the words "Don't let this happen again" in bold letters. Fire departments across the country began offering free training sessions for HOAs, teaching them how to work with first responders, their classes packed with board members eager to avoid Pinewood Estates' fate. Mike and his team at Station 12 became advocates in their own right, speaking at fire safety conferences about the importance of emergency access, their voices a powerful reminder of the stakes. "We lost Robert, but we saved others," Mike said at a conference in Atlanta, his uniform crisp, his eyes shining with pride. "Every gate we open, every life we save, is part of his legacy." The team also started a scholarship in Robert's name, awarded to high school students pursuing careers in firefighting or EMS. Their first recipient, a young woman named Sarah, who'd been inspired by the story to become a paramedic. "I want to make a difference, like you did," she told Mike at the award ceremony, her voice trembling with emotion. Mike smiled, his hand on her shoulder, his heart full. The community of Pinewood Estates honored Robert's memory in their own way, dedicating a small garden in the park to him, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Robert Ellis, a neighbor, a friend, a life worth saving." They planted his favorite flowers, tulips and daisies, around the plaque, their colors bright against the green grass, a place for reflection and healing. On the first anniversary of his death, they gathered in the garden, their voices raised in song, their candles glowing in the night. Emily at the center with her father's urn in her hands. "You're still with us, Dad," she said, her voice soft, her eyes on the plaque. "We'll never stop fighting for you." For Emily, the fight for justice had been a journey of grief and healing, her father's memory a guiding light. She moved to Savannah, buying a small house just outside Pinewood Estates, where she could be close to the community that had loved her father. She volunteered at the local library, continuing his book drives, and often sat in the garden, reading the history books he'd loved, her heart full of his presence. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, her fingers tracing the words on the plaque, the new gate a symbol of the change they'd fought for. Pinewood Estates was no longer a place of tragedy. It was a place of hope, a testament to the power of a community that refused to let a life be lost in vain. Robert Ellis's death was a tragedy that never should have happened, but his daughter Emily and the community of Pinewood Estates turned their grief into a movement for change. They took down an HOA that put rules over lives, won justice in the courtroom, and inspired Robert's law to protect others across the country. Now, this gate opens for all, first responders, neighbors, anyone who needs help because of their fight. This is HOA Karen Files, where we shine a light on the heroes who stand up to injustice. Have you or someone you know been blocked by an HOA during an emergency? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. We'll see you soon, and let's keep fighting for a world where no gate stands in the way of saving a life.